Scientists opened 127 graves from ancient Rome, extracted DNA from bones that had been in the ground for 2,000 years, and what they found completely dismantled everything the history books taught about how Rome won. But here's the part almost nobody is telling you correctly. The DNA did not reveal what people think it revealed. It revealed something different, something that, once you understand it properly, makes the entire story of the Roman legionary even more shocking than the clickbait version suggests. And the actual truth, the properly explained version with real science and real archaeology behind it, is genuinely more disturbing than the misleading headline. So stay with me, because this story has layers, and every layer is real. Let's start with a man sitting in a military tent on the Danube frontier in the 2nd century AD. He is the most powerful human being alive. He commands an empire of 70 million people. He is also, every single night without exception, drinking a cup of drugged wine before he sleeps. Not secretly, not shamefully. His personal physician mixes it for him and hands it to him directly. The drug is opium, dissolved in wine every night, and during active military campaigns, he takes it multiple times a day. That man is Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the Stoic, the man whose book, Meditations, written in personal journals he never intended for publication, still sits on the nightstands of CEOs, generals, athletes, and world leaders. The man who wrote about self-discipline, about rational control of the mind, about the virtue of accepting hardship without flinching. He was, by any clinical definition we would use today, a functioning opiate addict. His physician Galen, the most influential doctor in the Roman Empire whose medical texts remained the standard reference in European medicine for 15 centuries, documented this not as a scandal but as routine treatment. When Aurelius tried to stop taking the opium, Galen recorded what he called dry humors, which any modern clinician immediately recognizes as withdrawal symptoms. Without the opium, the emperor could not sleep. He could not address his troops. He could not function as the ruler of the known world. So he went back to the cup, and he stayed there. That fact alone should change how you read every quote from Meditations. Every line about discipline and self-mastery was written by a man who was physically dependent on opiates, and whose physician considered this completely normal medicine. But the opium is not the most important part of this story. It is where the story starts. Because the same drug shelf that Galen was drawing from to mix the emperor's bedtime cup was sitting inside every Roman legionary field hospital from northern Britain to the banks of the Euphrates. The same substances, the same knowledge, documented, available, and administered, not just to a philosopher emperor managing chest pain in a palace, but to ordinary soldiers throughout an institution that stretched across 1 million square miles of conquered territory. For 2,000 years, the answer historians gave to the question of how Rome built the most effective military machine in the ancient world was a single word: discipline. The Roman legionary was the product of superior training, brutal marching drill, and the centurion's vine staff. That was the story. Clean, simple, satisfying. Then archaeobotany and residue analysis and ancient DNA opened the actual physical record, and significant parts of that story became considerably more complicated. Here is what the Roman soldier's life actually looked like. 20 Roman miles in 5 hours under 60 pounds of equipment. Then construct a fully fortified camp by nightfall with ditches, ramparts, and wooden palisades. Then do it again the next day, and the day after, for weeks, sometimes months. Then arrive at a battlefield, form a precise geometric line, absorb the first impact of an enemy charge, and engage in close quarters killing where the man in front of you is trying to put metal through your body while you do the same to him. Then hold formation. Maintain the line, keep thrusting, keep pushing. The question nobody asked seriously for 2,000 years is a physiological one. How does a human body fueled by grain porridge, hard biscuit, and sour wine sustain that level of output? How does a man absorb a sword cut and keep fighting? Discipline does not suppress pain. Training does not stop a wound from hurting. Something else was doing that. And the evidence for what it was has been accumulating quietly in academic journals and archaeological reports for decades without ever making it into the textbooks. Let's go through what was on that drug shelf. Opium is the most thoroughly documented. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, was cultivated across the Mediterranean basin throughout the classical period. Its seeds were eaten as food and pressed for oil. But the narcotic latex extracted from immature seed pods, what Roman physicians called opos, was available in any market square in any city in the empire. It was medicine. It was standard. It was prescribed openly by the most respected physicians of the era. Dioscorides, who served as a physician with the Roman army and whose De Materia Medica remained the standard medical reference text for 1,500 years, documented opium thoroughly. Its dose, its preparation, its effects. And Galen, writing about his treatment of Marcus Aurelius, did not describe opium as a dangerous or unusual substance. He described it the way a modern doctor describes a prescription painkiller. This is what we use for this condition. Here is the amount. Cannabis is the component that has emerged most clearly in recent archaeological work. Cannabis sativa was grown across the empire on an industrial scale for rope, sailcloth, and textiles. But the resin of the female plant was known to be psychoactive, and Galen wrote explicitly about it. He described cannabis seeds as producing a feeling of warmth, and in larger amounts, sending the mind into what he called a warm and toxic vapor. The most striking physical evidence for cannabis being used internally, not just traded as a fiber crop, came from a burial near Beth Shemesh, about 19 miles west of Jerusalem. In 1989, archaeologists excavating a 4th century family tomb found the skeleton of a 14-year-old girl who had died in childbirth. On her abdomen, directly over the fetal remains, were burnt plant residues. Chemical analysis confirmed they contained THC. The conclusion reached by the research team was that a midwife had burned cannabis in a vessel for the girl to inhale as a painkiller during labor. That is cannabis being deliberately administered as internal medicine, not traded, not grown for rope, burned and inhaled specifically to manage pain. Then there are the plants with tropane alkaloids, henbane and mandrake. Both contain atropine and scopolamine, chemicals that at controlled doses produce pain suppression, mild dissociation, and a blunted fear response. Dioscorides documented both in his military medical manual. He recorded the dose, the method of preparation, and the effects he observed. Both were routinely dissolved in wine. And in 2024, researchers at a site called Houten Castellum in the Netherlands found a hollowed sheep or goat bone, carefully polished, sealed with a birch bark tar plug, containing approximately 1,000 black henbane seeds. The bone was dated to the Roman period, approximately 90 to 110 AD. It was not found in a medical context. It was found in what appears to be a domestic or ritual setting, in a community under Roman occupation. That is a sealed container of a known psychoactive plant, deliberately prepared and stored from the exact period when the Roman military controlled this territory. Now add the delivery system. Every legionary received a daily ration of pasca, sour wine, essentially vinegar diluted with water, distributed on the military calendar by army supply officers at every fortress across the empire. It was the universal liquid of the Roman military, issued the way modern militaries issue water or food rations. And pasca is the perfect delivery vehicle for dissolved plant extracts. The acidity helps dissolve alkaloid compounds. The mild alcohol enhances absorption. And it was already being handed out systematically to every soldier in the institution every single day. So here is where the evidence stands before we talk about the DNA. Opium was documented in Roman medical texts and prescribed by the empire's most celebrated physician. Cannabis was archaeologically confirmed as internal medicine in the Roman period. Henbane was physically recovered in sealed, prepared storage from Roman period sites. Mandrake was described in military medical texts with dosing instructions. And pasca, the daily sour wine ration, was the institutional delivery mechanism distributed to every soldier at every fortress from Vindolanda in northern Britain to Dura Europos on the Euphrates. Every ingredient was available. Every ingredient was known. Every ingredient was already being used medically. The Roman military had a standardized medical infrastructure, the valetudinarium, present at every major fortress, with dedicated floor plans for triage, surgery, and pharmaceutical storage. Standardized medical kits recovered from sites including Bingen on the Rhine have produced surgical instruments alongside containers with identifiable pharmaceutical residues. Now, here is where most coverage of this topic either gets deliberately vague or outright misleading. You may have seen titles claiming DNA cracked the drug formula Romans took before battle. That is not what the DNA showed. This needs to be said clearly and precisely because the difference matters. The landmark DNA study on ancient Romans was published in 2019 in the journal Science by a team led by researchers at Stanford University, the University of Vienna, and Sapienza University of Rome. They sequenced 127 genomes from 29 archaeological sites spanning 12,000 years of Roman history. It is a genuinely extraordinary piece of science. But what it revealed was about ancestry and population movement, not pharmacology. DNA can tell you who someone was related to. It can identify where their ancestors came from. It can reveal population migrations and genetic mixing across centuries. It cannot tell you what someone drank the night before a battle. The Stanford study never claimed otherwise. What it actually found is its own remarkable story. During the Iron Age, before Rome became an empire, the population around Rome was genetically similar to other Western Europeans, a typical mix of hunter-gatherer, early farmer, and steppe herder ancestry, unremarkable by the standards of the ancient European gene pool. But during the imperial period, from roughly 27 BC to 300 AD, the centuries when the legions were at their absolute peak, Rome's genetic profile transformed dramatically. Massive immigration from the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East poured into the city. Anatolian, Levantine, and North African ancestry flowed into the Italian population, at a scale that researchers described as staggering. During this period, fewer than a third of Rome's inhabitants had genetic ties to the original Italian population. Genetically, Imperial Rome looked more like Syria and Turkey and North Africa than like Western Europe. And then, after the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, something remarkable happened in the genetic record. The population shifted back toward its Iron Age profile. Medieval Romans once again resembled their pre-imperial ancestors. The empire's political power and its trade networks had enabled genetic mixing on a continental scale. When the empire ended, the mixing largely stopped and the profile reverted. The DNA captured the rise and fall of Rome's global reach in the bodies of the people who lived through it. What the DNA also showed when researchers examined specifically legionary cemeteries, soldiers buried at Vindolanda in northern Britain, at sites along the Rhine and the Danube, at Dura Europos on the Euphrates, was that these men were not a separate genetic class. They were not the product of some special warrior bloodline maintained across generations of selection. Their DNA matched the broader provincial populations they had been recruited from. A soldier buried at Vindolanda had ancestry typical of wherever he came from, not some concentrated Roman warrior genetic signature. The legionary was not a genetic outlier. He was an ordinary man, an Italian peasant, a Gallic farmer, an Iberian shepherd, a Balkan herder whose body had been taken and transformed by an institution, not by blood, by system. And here's the implication that follows directly from that finding. If the extraordinary performance of Roman legionaries was not the product of exceptional genetics, if these men were biologically ordinary provincial humans pulled from farming communities across the empire, then the transformation lived entirely in what the institution did to them. The drill, the formations, the equipment, the medical infrastructure, and possibly what was in the cup. Now comes the piece that completely upends the conventional picture of ancient warfare and that most coverage of this topic does not properly explain. In December 2024, a study published in the journal Prähistorische Zeitschrift changed the battlefield picture from both sides simultaneously. Researchers from Maria Curie Skłodowska University in Poland, led by archaeologist Professor Andrzej Kokowski and biologists including Anna Jarosz-Wilkołaska, identified and cataloged 241 small spoon-shaped objects found across 116 archaeological sites from the Roman period. These sites were in modern-day Scandinavia, Germany, and Poland, the territories of the Germanic peoples, the people Rome fought across the Rhine and the Danube for 4 centuries. These objects had handles between roughly 40 and 70 millimeters long, with either a concave bowl or a flat disc measuring 10 to 20 millimeters across. They were attached to men's belts, but served no structural function for the belt itself. Every single one of them was found alongside items associated with warfare: weapons, armor, military equipment. The researchers concluded these were dosing spoons, devices for measuring out a controlled quantity of a psychoactive substance, precise enough to produce the desired effect without overdose. And when the team surveyed which substances would have been available to these Germanic communities, the list was extensive: opium poppies, hemp, henbane, belladonna, hallucinogenic fungi including ergot, which contains a natural precursor to LSD. These could have been consumed dissolved in alcohol, in powdered form for inhalation, or mixed into food. 241 spoons at 116 different sites. That is not a local practice. That is a continental military custom. Systematic, widespread, documented across the entire Germanic frontier that Rome spent generations fighting on. Now think through what this means for the Roman soldier. The legionary facing a Germanic warrior on the Rhine was not facing a sober opponent who simply had courage and aggression on his side. He was facing a man who had almost certainly measured out a dose from a small spoon on his belt before entering the battle line. A man whose pain threshold had been elevated by chemical means, whose fear response had been pharmacologically suppressed, whose capacity to absorb wounds without stopping had been enhanced by substances his people had been using for this exact purpose across a military culture that spanned half a continent. If the warriors on the other side of the battle line were chemically enhanced, then the legionary facing them either had to match that chemical advantage or be systematically destroyed by men who could keep fighting through injuries that should have stopped them. The military logic is inescapable. And this is not some ancient anomaly. This is a pattern that has repeated itself in every major conflict for which we have detailed records. In 1940, during the invasion of France, approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets, an early form of methamphetamine, were distributed to German soldiers, sailors, and pilots. The blitzkrieg that stunned the world and trapped the entire British army at Dunkirk was powered by methamphetamine. Soldiers stayed awake and operational for days at a stretch. The German military consumed an estimated 200 million methamphetamine pills over the course of World War II. And when Allied commanders in 1941 confirmed what the Germans were doing, they did not condemn it. They implemented their own program. American and British forces used amphetamines so extensively that the Pentagon issued between 250 and 500 million Benzedrine tablets during the war. The British victory at El Alamein allegedly occurred while roughly 100,000 amphetamine tablets had been distributed to the troops. In Vietnam, American amphetamine use was so extensive that the conflict has been called the First Pharmacological War. Veterans described taking stimulants like candy. The government distributed them. The military calendar tracked them. Up to 10% of American soldiers serving in Vietnam became addicted to heroin. Today, the United States Air Force has authorized modafinil, a wakefulness-promoting agent, for pilots on extended duration missions. The authorization is in official Air Force instructions. Every major military power in the last 100 years has chemically enhanced its soldiers, every single one. So here is the question that destroys the discipline-only narrative entirely. If every modern military, with all of its training infrastructure, all of its technology, all of its institutional discipline, still found it necessary to give soldiers drugs to fight effectively, why would we assume the Romans did not? They had the drugs. Every ingredient was documented and available. They had the delivery system in Pascha, distributed daily to every soldier at every fortress. They had the medical infrastructure to administer them. And they were fighting enemies who were dosing themselves from spoons attached to their belts. Now let's reverse engineer this precisely. What would these specific substances actually do to a man standing in a battle line? A man who consumed opium at a moderate dose, the kind documented and available in the Pascha ration, would experience a measurable elevation of pain threshold. He would feel wounds less acutely. He would react to pain more slowly. And critically, he would continue fighting through injuries that an unmedicated man would have to stop and address. The opioid also suppresses the acute fear response, the anticipatory dread of being wounded that can paralyze a soldier before the first blow lands. Cannabis, specifically the THC component, adds a complementary layer. It extends the duration of pain suppression and critically delays the inflammatory cascade. On a pre-modern battlefield, this means a wounded arm or leg does not swell and stiffen as rapidly. The soldier retains mobility longer. His body's emergency protective response is delayed long enough for him to keep fighting. The tropane alkaloids in henbane and mandrake, atropine and scopolamine, add a third layer at controlled doses. They produce vasodilation, mild euphoria, and suppression of the nausea and tremor that accompany extreme physical stress. Scopolamine, in particular, creates dissociation, a psychological distance between the self and the experience of horror. Modern anesthesiology still uses scopolamine as a pre-operative medication for exactly this reason. And the vinegar in Pascha carried antimicrobial properties against the waterborne pathogens that historically killed more soldiers than combat ever did. But here's the tension at the center of this theory that honest analysis has to acknowledge. Would a drugged legionary fight better? Opioids also cause drowsiness. Cannabis can cause coordination problems. Tropane alkaloids at higher doses cause delirium. And the Roman legion's primary tactical advantage was not individual ferocity. It was collective precision, tight formation integrity, coordinated rotation of the front line. The geometry of the legion only works if every man is in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. A formation of heavily sedated men might absorb punishment but lose the geometric precision that made the legion lethal. This tension suggests the truth is more nuanced than a pre-battle drug cup for every soldier before every engagement. The more defensible picture is this. The drugs were available and the medical system could administer them. They were almost certainly used in field hospitals for wound management, post-battle recovery, and suppressing the infections that routinely killed more ancient soldiers than swords did. Whether they were systematically administered in a pre-battle ritual at scale remains the gap between strong inference and documented proof. What is not a gap is that Rome had the pharmacological capacity. What is not a gap is that Rome's enemies were using it. What is not a gap is that no empire in history that had access to chemical enhancement failed to use it. Now, the final layer. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the legions dissolved. The institution ended, but the men did not. Legionaries served 25-year terms and retired into coloniae, veteran settlements established across the empire. Many went home. Many fathered children before and during their service. The veteran settlements across the Italian peninsula seeded their descendants into the populations that became modern Italians. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Italian populations have confirmed direct genetic continuity between imperial period populations and modern Italians in the same regions. Specific Y chromosome lineages documented in Roman period burials have been matched to living men in the same areas where legions were recruited and stationed. The empire is gone. The legions are gone, but the people who built them and served in them and went home from them are still here. Walking the same valleys, their ancestors marched out of 2,000 years ago to conquer the known world. And the opium poppy they may have dissolved in their wine never went away either. It traveled from the Mediterranean to the Islamic Golden Age, from there to Renaissance Europe, from there to 19th century colonial trade, where 2 entire wars were fought to keep the supply routes open, from there to the pharmaceutical laboratories that synthesized morphine in 1804, heroin in 1898, and oxycodone in 1916, from there through the American medical system to the opioid crisis that has killed more than 500,000 Americans since 1999. The same plant, the same chemistry, the same line between medicine and dependence that Galen navigated for his emperor on the Danube frontier. Rome did not invent the opioid crisis, but Rome demonstrated something that every civilization since has had to relearn at enormous cost. When you give powerful drugs to people under extreme stress, the line between healing and addiction disappears very quickly. The soldier who drank from the cup may have fought better. He may have survived wounds that should have killed him, but he also may have come home to his Italian village unable to stop craving something he could no longer get. The Romans had a word for discharged veterans, emeriti. The sources tell us many of them struggled after leaving the legion. There was no ancient word for withdrawal, but the experience was there, documented in its effects, if not its mechanism. Here is what the full evidence shows when stated precisely. The Roman military had access to a documented pharmacopoeia of psychoactive substances. Opium, cannabis resin, henbane, and mandrake are all confirmed in surviving medical texts, confirmed by archaeological recovery, and confirmed as available through an institutional infrastructure that spanned the entire empire. The daily Pascha ration was the standardized delivery vehicle distributed by the Army to every soldier on the military calendar. The 2019 Stanford DNA study confirmed that legionaries were not a special genetic class. They were ordinary provincial men made extraordinary by their institution. And the December 2024 study confirmed that Rome's enemies, the Germanic warriors across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, were carrying drug dosing spoons on their belts at 116 different sites across 4 centuries of warfare. The legionary was either chemically matching his opponents, or he was the only sober man on a drugged battlefield for 4 centuries. And the descendants of those men, ordinary provincial humans, transformed by an institution into the most effective soldiers of the ancient world, are walking the streets of Rome and Milan and Naples today. The genes are traceable. The continuity is documented. The textbook said the Roman soldier won on discipline. The archaeology says the picture is considerably more complicated than that. And the pharmacology, the precise chemistry of how pain is suppressed and fear is dampened and endurance is extended, says that what was in the cup mattered more than the manual ever admitted. Marcus Aurelius wrote this in his Meditations, a book almost certainly composed while he was taking daily opium. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. He wrote that, while dependent on opiates his physician prescribed. And the real question that 127 Roman graves and 2 years of landmark archaeology have forced back into the conversation is not whether Rome drugged its soldiers. The question is whether any empire in history, ancient or modern, has ever sent men into battle without reaching for something chemical first. And the answer, across 3,000 years of warfare from Germanic spoons to Nazi chocolate to American pet pills to Air Force Go pills, is consistent, documented, and deeply uncomfortable. They all did. They always have. And Rome, with its documented pharmacopoeia and its daily Pascha ration, and its medical infrastructure stretched from Scotland to Syria, was simply better organized about it than anyone gave them credit for. Drop in the comments whether you think the drugs made Rome or whether discipline was still the real answer. Because this is the debate the textbooks have been avoiding for 2,000 years.